Hawkins to see if she will be able to join as well.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. We have some important things to discuss today, in particular the proposed changes in the regs for the main form for the RIPA data. So we're just going to quickly introduce ourselves, and we can also just go to the minutes, and then we'll go to a presentation by the DOJ staff, which I believe will. And that, along with the conversation that to follow, will occupy most of today's meeting. So I'm Steve Raphael, UC Berkeley professor and co-chair of the data subcommittee. So if we can get, how about Lily? You want to go next?
Thank you. I'm Lily Kajavi, professor of mathematics at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and also a member of the STOP Data subcommittee.
Okay, and Brendan?
I'm Brendan Woods, a public defender of Alameda County, member of the committee.
Yeah, I'm trying to see who else is here. Are there other board members that I can't see on my screen? Okay, I don't believe so. So would the DOJ staff like to introduce themselves? Tanya?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Koshi. I'm a Deputy Attorney General with the Civil Rights Enforcement Section, and I'm working with other folks on our proposed amendments to our regulations. You should have a copy of the proposed text. If you don't, please let me know. We'll put the link in the chat box. In addition to the proposed text, there should be the revised version of the STOP data form, as well as a chart kind of summarizing all the changes within the proposed text. I'm looking at the agenda right now. It looks like we've devoted about an hour and a half to overview of those proposed changes, as well as a discussion. I think because of just, for sake of efficiency, it might make sense for us just to actually just walk through all of the proposed changes at once and then discuss them at the same time, and have board members provide their feedback.
Okay, sounds good.
I know meeting last week, but I'll just repeat some of what I said there. We issued the first round of regulations in 2017 with the understanding that we would have to at some point revise and refine them. And since 2017, we have gotten a lot of feedback from board members, from agencies, from experts, and also from just our staff internally about how to clarify existing obligations and then other additional categories of information, or what we call data elements that needed to be added to the regulations. So that's what you have in front of you right now. Is just a collection of a lot of people's feedback and insight into how to make these regulations better. And AB 953, requires the AG's office to consult with the board and other stakeholders. And how we're envisioning this process to go is, we'd workshop the proposed amendments with you all today, and take in any of your feedback, not just about what we've proposed, but if you have additional amendments that you would like to include, let us know and we'll evaluate that. And then we'll go back internally and refine our proposal and then give it to the AG for approval. We also plan on having a board meeting, where we would present the proposals to the entire board. We just have to give 60 days of notice for that meeting. There's a lot of material here, so to the extent the subcommittee needs an additional meeting to discuss these proposals, happy to do that. We just would need to give 10 days notice. So I think what would be helpful, it looks like we already have that as part of the agenda for next steps. As part of those next steps, we could consider whether or not the subcommittee wants to have an additional meeting about these proposals. Dr. Raphael, if it works for you, I think what I would do is we could start with the STOP data form and just walk through that. Oh, you're on mute. Dr. Eiffel, you're on mute. Thank you.
Yeah, I hear that quite often these days. Just a quick point of order. Should we approve the minutes before we get into our discussion? Since I think we have 3 of 5 where we are able to do that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so do I have a motion to approve the minutes? This is from the October 8th meeting.
I move to approve the minutes.
We have a second.
Sorry, I'll
Okay, so-
second. Had to unmute. Sorry. Okay.
So all in favor? I guess I just have to say aye. We're done. All right. So let's roll, Tanya. Let's go. Sounds good.
Great. And, my role here is just to take notes, but there are other DOJ staff members here as well. So to the extent you have questions, we're happy to answer them about why we chose the particular proposals we've made. So in the PDF that you have, you'll see at the top right corner, there's page numbers. So I just want to point that out because we might be going back and forth between the stop data form and then the text as well. And when we're looking at the text, I'll refer to that page number at the top right-hand corner. So I think what would make sense, is just the first proposal we have is to add a data element called nature of stop. And that gives officers the choice of choosing either vehicular stop or pedestrian stop. And just as background, this was suggested by experts on whether, basically to show that it might be harder to differentiate vehicular stops versus pedestrian stops without a data element like that. And it's not possible just to rely on looking at the vehicle code as a way to differentiate pedestrian stops from vehicle stops. So that was the proposal that we have right now, and I'll just leave it up to the board members if they have any questions or feedback about that.
Did you want us to weigh in as we go through each of?
I think that would be great. I think that might be the most efficient, and if not, we can just try to figure out something else. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, then go ahead.
Just one thought. If it's helpful, the text of that proposed regulation is on page 12 of the PDF.
So the one comment I would have about this is just to be clear about the data elements, maybe instead of nature, if it was stop type, and then also to add a bicycle stop category, I think would be worth adding if this was going to be something added to the form. Did anyone else have some comments on this particular element?
Yeah, I had a similar comment or question. I don't know if anyone else is. I hear a little feedback. Well, I'll just carry on. Yeah, I'm the overwhelming number of stops will probably be, will be vehicles, will be cars, and then, but also pedestrians. There are large numbers of pedestrians in some areas, and bicycles is a very small fraction. And I was wondering, so I also think it's worth distinguishing, I'll say driver, passenger, cyclist, pedestrian. Some of those might be differentiated later, like there might be a passenger. I'm trying to remember as I looked ahead at the red coding. So, driver versus passenger might not be necessary here, but I was wondering if there's any other category we haven't thought of, and if so, if cyclist and other should be grouped. But I think it's very important to separate out the car stops and the pedestrian stops with this achieves. But yeah, where would if it stood as it does now, would cyclists go under a vehicular stop? And if so, is there a way to differentiate it later?
This is Tanya. Just to answer your question, there isn't any existing data element or data value that would add goal to this type of stop or nature of stop data element. That would be one way to differentiate.
Tanya, I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time? Were you saying that there isn't a cyclist differentiation?
No, there's not. Yeah. But to your other question about passenger, there is a proposal about adding a data value for passengers at a later point. You'll see it.
So I had one related question. I'm wondering if there are some law enforcement agencies that are collecting, in addition to these fields, as they're complying with the Assembly bill, but they do collect cyclist data. I had the impression, based on some reporting that was done in Long Beach, for example, in Long Beach, California, that there's a way to pull out stops that were maybe because of a cycling violation. Maybe something is coded later in terms of the type of violation. But so I guess I want to then echo what Professor Raphael suggested, that there be an additional category, even though I think there'll be very few cyclists, so it could be reasonable to have an other category. So either cyclist or other as a third category here, just so we can really pull out the car stops and the pedestrian stops cleanly, but that also those others are very different in nature.
Okay, Tanya, should we move on, I guess?
Sounds good. So the next amendment is to location. As you'll see, we are proposing to add an option for officers to provide geographic coordinates or geocoordinates when providing the location of the stop. And the purpose of this is that we've gotten some feedback from agencies that they would like to provide that. Additionally, for analysis purposes, it's more accurate as well. Does anyone have thoughts or feedback about this one? Okay, hearing none, I'll move on to the other amendment, which is to add unincorporated area so that an officer can provide not just the city, but the unincorporated area. Our existing system does allow officers to provide that the address and the so just to have it be consistent with our existing system.
You broke up again,
so
Tanya. Unincorporated is a good idea.
Okay, thank you. Any other feedback or thoughts? Okay. And I just noticed that Chief Swing is on the line. Chief Swing, we just finished discussing nature of stop, geographic coordinates, and unincorporated area, those proposed amendments. I just wanted to give you a chance if you had any feedback about those that you'd like to provide. I think you're on mute.
Had it on double mute, screen and phone. No comments at this time. Thank you for the welcome.
Thanks. Our next one.
This is Nancy. I was gonna say I saw member Lawanza Hawkins on the line as well, so everyone is here.
Oh, great. Welcome. Board Member Hawkins, I just want to give you an opportunity as well to provide any feedback on the three proposals that we've made so far and discussed. And just before I get to that, what we're looking at right now is a stop data form that was provided to you and attached to the invite. And we just looked at nature of stop, a proposal to add geographic coordinates to as an option as location of stop, and unincorporated area for location of stop. So I just wanted to provide you an opportunity to provide any feedback as well.
I have no feedback.
Okay, great, thank you. So moving on, the next one is an amendment to the perceived gender of persons stopped. So we changed male and female to cisgender man, boy, and cisgender woman, girl, respectively, and replaced gender nonconforming with non-binary adult and child. And the purpose of this change was to have our categories be more accurate and more reflective of contemporary understandings of gender. Does anyone have feedback or thoughts on this one? Okay, seeing a few shaking heads, so, okay, and a thumbs up, perfect. The next one is perceived sexual orientation of the person stopped. Prior to this, it was the person stopped perceived to be LGBT. And the way it works for officers is that if they selected either a transgender man, boy, or transgender woman, girl, the system would automatically select yes for this data element person perceived as LGBT. And so there were a couple of concerns with this. One is the conflation of sexual orientation and gender identity. We wanted to separate those out because those are separate things. We also wanted to make sure that we acknowledged that there are other sexual orientations other than lesbian, gay, and bisexual. So we separated it out to LGBT plus and straight/heterosexual. Does anyone have feedback about this?
I just wanted to say, I mean, I think we know language and are understanding everything's rapidly on the move, and I really appreciate the DOJ's efforts to try to find ways to, you know, on the one hand, set up categories for data collection, but also to really reflect use a broad way and modern way of using the language. So I think these are all reasonable steps. So thank you.
That's great, and credit goes to Anna Rick for putting this together, this particular data element.
This is
any other thoughts?
Sure, I think it's great also. And my knowledge around the language is limited. I'll be the first to admit that I'm not as well versed as I should be. I was wondering if we had input from the LGBTQ community, if these are acceptable in terms that they appreciate to be used.
We have not yet run this by those organizations. We did with the existing regulations, but it's definitely on our list of things to do. So I appreciate that feedback. Any other? Okay, moving on. The next one is we're on page 3 at the right-hand corner. So Chief Swing and Board Member Hawkins. When I reference page numbers, I'm referencing the page number at the top right-hand corner of the PDF. So the next one is perceived homeless status. And the reason for this additional data element is, a lot of cities and jurisdictions are, there's an increase in policies around criminalizing homelessness, and a lot of people who are homeless have expressed that they have had harassment at the hands of officers. And so in order to track this kind of these interactions, we thought it would be important to include perceived homeless status. And it was also a suggestion by, I believe, a few organizations during the initial round of regulations. And I think the only reason why we did not include it at that time is we were trying to streamline the number of data elements we would include. But, given the amount of attention that has been placed on some of these policies, it seemed like a worthwhile data element to include. Any thoughts on this one?
I just want to add, this is consistent with the recent Inspector General's report regarding the LAPD to collect homeless perceived status as well.
Thank you. I'll take note of that as well. I also should point out that if you have feedback on the language within the regs for these particular elements, please let me know as well. I realize I'm not giving you an opportunity necessarily to look at that language, but if you do have any feedback, let me know. So the next proposed amendment, well, there's several. So we're seeking to add several different data values under reason for stop. So the first one is probable cause to arrest or search. And the reason for this is Agencies have come to us and said, there are circumstances when an officer at the time that they made the stop didn't just have reasonable suspicion, they had probable cause. And there isn't a data value right now in the existing regs for them to accurately reflect what happened at the time of the stop. They would just have to select reasonable suspicion. So to account for that, we propose adding probable cause to arrest or search. Any thoughts about this one?
Tanya, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chief Swing.
Good. Thanks, Dr. Raphael. When I see it, the only question I have is, does it accomplish what the agency was trying to accomplish in differentiating between probable cause and reasonable suspicion? Because since probable cause is a higher level of a higher standard, if you would, the reasonable suspicion, then if we don't differentiate out reasonable suspicion or probable cause, then it's really one and the same. We could just say reasonable suspicion or greater, and that would be the same thing as saying reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Because if you have probable cause, you have reasonable suspicion. I think our attorneys would agree with that.
And to your point, something that's not reflected in this stop data form, but we'll discuss after we go through this data form, is we are proposing definitions for both probable cause and reasonable suspicion for that very reason, to make sure that all officers are on the same page about why you would select one or the other.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, so I just had a quick question about the structure of the questions. So is the way the form is filled out that if you tick probable cause, then the other sort of elements become a possibility, or do you open up and you see all of these possibilities and you check everything that applies? I was just trying to think about ways that the questions could be asked to make sure that we're getting accurate responses and how they're nested.
Yeah, so it's not clear if it's a reasonable suspicion. We added in red or, so if you select either reasonable suspicion or probable cause, you would then select one of these other bases for reasonable suspicion or probable cause, if that makes sense. So like the electronic version of the form, as I understand it, and there might be others on the phone who know better than me, but if you select one of those, it'll then prompt you to provide the basis for your reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Did that answer your question? Okay.
And that helps clarify mine. Thank you for that question, Dr. Raphael. I didn't read it like that initially, so thank you for that.
Okay, great. I'm seeing some things in the chat. Just so you know, we'll leave some time for public comment as well, and we'll be able to address some of those questions that you have. Unless, Nancy or Allison, you think I should address them now?
No, I think it's fine to address them during public comment. Please.
Okay,
yeah.
Sounds good.
I'm sorry, this is Brendan. My copy is in black and white that I printed, and I'm trying to make sure that I understand exactly, because I agree with Chief Swing about what, it seems like it's just capturing the same data in the same pool. Is it going to be a check for reasonable suspicion and a check for probable cause, is the way it's been explained?
Yeah, so what you're seeing is you see either reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And probable cause to arrest or search, that's a proposal that we're trying to add. And so if you select one or the other, you'll see that or, that's also redlined. So we're adding in the or as well. So if you select either one of those, then you would get a drop-down menu and you'd have to select the basis for your reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And then you see roughly like 10 bases that you can select, and you can select all that are applicable. Does that answer your question, board member Woods?
I think so.
Okay. Any other questions or thoughts about this? Okay, so moving on, the next change is for suspicion or cause. It add match description of suspect's vehicle or vehicle observed at the scene of the crime. The reason for this change is there's an existing data value called match suspect description. And as it reads, it can mean a number of things. It can mean that the suspect's, physical appearance matches the subject who was stopped or their car. And so what we wanted to do is separate those out. So we have match suspect description and match description of a suspect's vehicle or vehicle observed at the scene. Coupled with that, we are proposing two definitions, one for match suspect description, one for match description of suspect's vehicle. So we define match suspect's description as matching the physical appearance of the suspect, and the other one I think is obvious, it matches the vehicle of the suspect. Any thoughts about this one? Okay, hearing none. The next one, hopefully, oh, I skipped one, sorry. The next one is witness or victim identification of suspect and or questioning at the scene. And for Board Member Woods, what's changed is the and or questioning is added in. Prior to this, it was just witness or victim identification of suspect at the scene. The reason for this change, there are scenarios where a witness or a victim may not feel like they are free to leave and are stopped because they're there to be questioned by an officer about a scenario, about an incident. And I think particularly for this one, it might be helpful to look at the language of the regulations. I'm just going to direct your attention to, let's see, page, where is it? Page 17 and 18 of the PDF. Again, the page number is at the top right-hand corner. Because there's some additional language explaining when an officer would select this data value. So I'll just give a moment for everyone to read it. Again, at page 17 and 18. Does anyone have thoughts about this one? This change?
This is David Swing. The way that I read this feels like if an officer responds to a residential burglary and contacts the victim whose home was broken into, that the officer must then fill out a form because they're a victim if that victim provided any type of identifying information about the potential suspect. Is that, just as an example, is that an accurate understanding? And if so, is that a stop? It seems to expand the definition. Under that premise, it seems to expand the definition of what a stop is, also to include witnesses. Because then the witness, say it's a street crime, and someone identifies a potential suspect, that witness now has to have a form completed. And how does that accomplish our mission related to racial and identity profiling in that particular universe?
If I could add to Chief Swing's question, I was wondering as well whether people who would fall under this category as a witness or someone who called for service, if they're currently having RIPA forms filled out in those interactions. I assume that it was only for traffic stops or stops when there was some potential enforcement action.
Hi, this is LaWanda, and my question is, when you say that there is a victim and there's a form that has to be completed only if the victim indicates the perpetrator or says something about the perpetrator, or is it automatically because you're a victim, a form is going to be filled out to assist you as a victim?
Member Hawkins, can you repeat that again? I'm just taking notes so that we can take in your feedback. So I missed the part about, are you asking if this is, if there'd be a form filled out?
Chief
Trying to
Swing, I think Chief Swing indicated that there was a form that had to be filled out for the victim. Am I correct, Chief Swing, if there was a victim involved?
As I read it, going back to this, it says should reflect if an officer questions a victim of a suspected crime or witness to a suspected crime, accident, fire, or other event for the purposes of identifying a suspect or questioning about the suspected crime. This really expands that definition. Reading that really expands. Traffic collisions are now included. A potential fire is included, and so I'd like clarification on what we're trying to understand by gathering this data. That's what I'm trying to understand first, is what are we trying to accomplish, and what part of potential profiling are we trying to root out, or bias are we trying to root out? Are we looking at, is this a bias by proxy kind of perspective, or just it's a question to understand?
Thank you. This is all helpful, and I think what makes most sense if we take in your feedback and see how and whether or not we should refine it, because this feedback and these concerns that all of you have are helpful.
Yeah,
This is Brendan. I'm sorry.
Oh, I think I would just jump in and say, sorry, Member Woods, but I would just jump in and say it is not our intent to make an officer fill out stop data form out if they're talking to a witness or a victim. So, because I don't think that helps forward the goal of identifying racial and identity profiling. So as Tanya was saying, I think this is all really good feedback that, part of this exercise is to have your perspective and input so that we can see if there's things that we may have misunderstood or it just didn't put it in a clear way. So that is not the intent here. The person, it would, in order for this to stop data form to be used, they would have to be detained or searched. So that standard has not changed. And so, as I said, we'll take a look at that.
Thank you.
So, I'm sorry, this is Brendan. I thought, I could be wrong, I thought this was referring to the reason for the search or stop, and it would be based on the witness or victim identification of a potential suspect. And they would check that reason. Does that make sense?
Sorry, what was it? This is a data value under reason for a stop, and that you would check one of these.
So this would be checked based
as
on
your reason. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that maybe this came up because officers had indicated that there were often times where they would be talking to someone, and then while they're talking to someone in a consensual encounter, there may be in something that comes to their attention that they then have to detain the person. But I think that there's a better way to deal with this, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, this does not reflect that, I don't think, but yeah, okay.
Wouldn't that rise to the level of reasonable suspicion? If they're talking to someone and then through that they have a witness identification, wouldn't that then rise to the level of reasonable suspicion and be included under that umbrella potentially? I don't know. Just
Yeah.
I'll wait. Just back. I'll wait for the comments back once DOJ staff has had a chance to look at it a little bit closer. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you. This is all helpful. I just need to. Okay. Anyone have other thoughts or feedback about this one? Like I said, I'm primarily in listening mode, so just trying to take this in and to the extent we can refine some of these proposals. Any additional thoughts about this one? Okay. So the next one hopefully is straightforward, is adding in, so it's other reasonable suspicion or probable cause that a crime has occurred. So adding in language about probable cause. So it's just like an other catch-all category that's been expanded to include probable cause. Any thoughts about this one? Okay, seeing none. We are considering adding in another data value called welfare or wellness check or community caretaking under reason for stop. The reason for this is there are a number of scenarios where an officer stops a person for the purposes of a wellness check or community caretaking function, and it's a stop for those purposes, and a scenario could be that they eventually detain that person under 5150. Under existing regulations, there's no sort of accurate data value under reason for stop that they can select. And so what some officers have done is select reasonable suspicion. And from there, I believe they check, we checked community caretaking under the offense code. And then from there, they have to select other reasonable suspicion of a crime. And since, a 5150 is not, reasonable suspicion doesn't accurately account for those scenarios where there's a 5150 or where there was a welfare check. And so what we're proposing here is to add a data value so that an officer can select this. We are also on top of that adding a definition of welfare or wellness check / community caretaking and providing some scenarios as examples so that an officer knows when to check this particular data value. And the definition, if you wanted to take a look, is on page 11. I'll give the board members some time to look at the definition and examples and see if you all have feedback.
I think it seems reasonable.
Does anyone have other thoughts?
No, that seems like a sensible addition and a great way to identify, the extent to which officers are engaged in those kinds of stops. I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
I'm actually also curious to hear from the board on this one, because I feel like this is an issue that I keep going back and forth on, and I think we all do, because in order for there to be a stop recorded, it has to be a detention or a search. And so I'm particularly wondering, like, when someone is being approached by the officer initially because it's a welfare check, at what how do we get then to the detention, right? So that's kind of, I'm wondering if this is also, Steve, from like a data point, if this is something that we want to capture from a legal standpoint. Is this how we want to go? And so if you guys, if you want to maybe give this also a little bit more thought too, because I just, it's something that I've been kind of going back and forth on for several years, because in order to fill out the stop data form, it has to be a detention. And I don't know if doing it in this way captures that, because we have situations where you hear, certain law enforcement agencies are not necessarily doing, they're like, for example, if there's a call that someone is walking down the street in their pajamas, and the officer goes out and all that person is doing is walking down the street in their pajamas, they're not doing anything else. There's questions now about, should the officer even go talk to that person? And if they do go talk to that person in as a wellness check, if that person says, I'm fine, go away, do we have to fill out a stop data form? If the person is in a crisis or needs something, do we need to fill out that stop data form? So these are like big questions that I still, and we all still have. And so if you have any other sort of impact or insights into that, I'd really be interested to hear.
Well, I do have some thoughts. I'm, just from a researcher's standpoint, even if it was somebody's walking down the street in their pajamas and the officer stops the person, talks with them, and that's the end, to the person is really disoriented or lost or has wandered away from home, and then the officer finds out where the person lives and, takes action or, matches the person's services or brings someone to an emergency room. I guess it doesn't really serve the kind of goal of RIPA, but it does say something about a responsibility that law enforcement has, and I think that there would be some benefit to understanding, how often stops like that are occurring. And I guess the question from a legal standpoint is, if someone, say, is likely to be a harm to themselves, and they're not necessarily arrested and booked, but they're brought to a hospital or brought home to a family member, is that considered detention? And I imagine it is, but I don't know. I'm not an attorney.
Well, if an officer puts on a hold for mental health reasons, that is a detention. And so that would qualify as a stop. To the earlier question about if the officer contacts someone just to check on their welfare, walking down the street in their pajamas, and they're just out for a walk, then that wouldn't necessarily constitute a stop, and everyone would be on their way.
This is Brendan. I think it's a great category to include because we really are, if I'm reading the form correctly, this is the reason for the detention, reason for reasonable suspicion or probable cause. So we do want to capture that. There could be a welfare or wellness stop, and there may not be reasonable suspicion or a rise to level of detention. We see that happen when someone's just parked in their car, and that becomes a wellness or well-being stop. So I think it's a great category to include for those reasons.
Maybe just another thought. This gets to, I guess, the question that we were just discussing about whether someone had witnessed someone and whether they should be reported upon. And is there an overarching definition that defines interactions with the public where a RIPA form needs to be filled out and interactions where they don't? And it seems like a intention to detain or potential to detain or some sort of standard should be. I'm not even sure what the dividing line is, and I imagine we always face the threat that we extend the kind of record keeping to more and more interactions. But maybe, Nancy, would it be possible to advise us on a general definition of an interaction aside from these categories, where one would say, a stop form had to be filled out?
So the statute is what really governs whether a stop form has to be filled out, and it includes all detentions. So, and we've defined the detention in the regulations based upon common law about what it, or not common law, but what the law says a detention is. So when the person, it feels that they are not free to leave, either by verbal commands of the officer or other authority exerted over the person. And then a consensual search, because the legislature also has said that a consensual search and is required, and all searches actually. So all searches, including consensual searches. So so that's kind of where we are on this. And so I guess I keep coming back to this, and maybe Brendan, you answered this question, but is a welfare or wellness check, I guess it can be the basis for a detention. So so if we're saying that if you were detained because of a welfare or wellness check, community caretaking, I'm okay with that. I just, my concern is also those situations where people do a welfare check where it may not be a detention. So, but it sounds like this works.
Can I ask a related question? I mean, I'm looking at the scenarios, which are very helpful. That was item 19, descriptions of sample welfare or wellness check stops. But I was thinking, if you actually were filling out one of these forms, two of the scenarios involve being called to someone's home or apartment. And then I was thinking the very first step was checking off vehicular stop or pedestrian stop. And maybe now adding bicycling stop, because I realize vehicle might mean motorized vehicle. So I'm thinking about the very first item on the form, and then going down to this one and sort of how to reconcile them. I mean, I think it is of interest to understand, getting this window into policing, and these wellness checks are a real, I'm not sure what the right label is, but wellness check is a real phenomenon. Is the form consistent with that? Maybe this is really just going back to the very first item. Maybe at the end we can revisit that. But so I'm sort of also wrestling with, at what point, what triggers filling out the form or not? And if so, how do these categories of stops fit in? Because maybe, the scenarios that are given, it might not have been a vehicle or a pedestrian stop. And yet I'm hearing that there's, interest in better understanding the interactions between law enforcement and the public. I guess I'm also a little bit curious what some of the other subcommittees might think about this category, and in particular, there are folks who might have some good perspective.
I think that's a good point. Maybe pedestrian isn't the best word, because it does capture, you would have to fill out a stop data form if someone's executing a warrant in the home and they do additional actions. So maybe pedestrian isn't the best. Maybe we do vehicle, bicycle, or other stop.
Although I'll just add, I think pedestrian itself as a category is really meaningful. I don't know, in Los Angeles, probably annually, there are far more traffic stops, but there can be hundreds of thousands of pedestrian stops too. So it really might rise to the level of its own category. Maybe at the end we could swing back and I can just look up and read off what the LAPD Inspector General suggested some categories. These don't have to match those suggestions, but that might be worth our just having in the minutes at the end.
Yeah, in urban population centers, there are a lot of pedestrian stops.
Yeah.
It's just a reality.
Right.
It sounds like what all of you are saying, that it might require more categories within nature of stop, but also maybe definitions as well for each of those categories, so that we're all on the same page, right?
Yeah, and of course, there's a merit to keeping the forms simple and just having those two
Sure.
categories initially, vehicular, pedestrian. I can see why we would want to do that when we want to do that. Maybe I'll just flip to it now. The Inspector General report suggests vehicle, pedestrian, bicycle stop, and then driver, passenger, pedestrian as another category. Neither of those speak to this issue that's now come up. What if it's a call for service to an apartment or something like that? But somehow, yeah, I think maybe we have to swing back to that very first checkoff box. Vehicular stop clearly is a major, probably the most dominant statewide class of stops. Pedestrian, especially in urban areas, there are hundreds of thousands. Well, statewide, much more. But then maybe, yeah, besides cyclists, maybe there's an other. It's not always great to have a category that just says other. You think, oh my goodness, what's in there? But on the other hand, it stops us from conflating the other, at least they're separated out somehow.
I think we need to explain other too. If we have other, there
Yeah.
needs to be a box that gives an explanation what
Mhm.
is other. And isn't there a category when you go to someone's home for a welfare check or domestic violence? Isn't there a box already on the form for law enforcement?
So the way it works right now is you have to check reasonable suspicion, and then you have to check under that for offense code. You have to select, I just had it, I think it was community caretaking. And from there, select other reasonable suspicion for crime. So there isn't a check or caretaking. I hope that answers your question, Board Member Hawkins.
I apologize, Tanya. Could you
Okay.
repeat that one? Could you repeat that one more time? Maybe it was just on my end, but I lost the last part of what you were saying.
Yeah, I
Thank
have
you.
bad reception here, so I'm sorry. So right now, if you are conducting a welfare check or community caretaking function, you have to check, well, at least some officers, what they've been doing is selecting reasonable suspicion that a person was engaged in criminal activity under reason for stop. And under that, in the form itself, once you select that, they've selected community caretaking as the offense code. And then from there, other reasonable suspicion for crime. So it's kind of like a roundabout way, and it's not totally, like I was saying, it's not accurate really for what they were doing.
LaWanda, I think to your earlier point, item number 13 is what speaks to it being a call for service. And so the data could be cross-tabulated to include all the welfare checks or welfare stops that were a call for service. So there is a way to break that data out in a closer review.
Thanks, Chief Thorne. That's helpful to add.
Thank you, Chief.
Does anyone have other thoughts about the welfare wellness check / community caretaking proposal? Okay. Moving on, the next proposal is to require officers to select when the stop person is a passenger in a vehicle to note that, and to note when the stopped person is inside of a residence when the officer is executing a search or arrest warrant, naming or identifying another person, conducting a search, pursuant to someone's supervision status, another person's supervision status, or conducting a compliance check on another person. As it stands now, existing regulations, I'll start with the first one. Existing regulations require officers to complete a stop data form for passengers when the passenger has violated a vehicle code or other section of the vehicle code or penal code, or if the officer has taken actions toward that passenger. But right now, there's no way other than in a narrative section for an officer to indicate that the stopped person is a passenger. So we wanted to be able to readily separate out those stops that involve a passenger of a vehicle. And then for the second one, again, if actions are taken towards a person inside a residence who is not the subject of, either a warrant or a supervision status or a compliance check. Unless you're putting it in the narrative field, there's really no way for us to figure out whether or not the subject is a person inside a residence. So this is to just deal with those two scenarios where we can't readily pull out that information. Any thoughts about this one? Okay, I'm seeing shaking heads on a few of you. Okay. Moving on to the next ones, we have several additions and amendments to actions taken by an officer during a stop. So the first two involve canines. So what we have here is canine removed from peace officer's vehicle and peace officer's canine used to search. So the initial data value that we had was canine removed from vehicle or used to search. The sense was those are two different actions. You know, removing a canine is different from using it to search. And so to differentiate those different actions, we thought it made sense to separate out into different data values. And we added peace officer just to make it clear that we're referring to the peace officer's canine, not any other person's canine. Any thoughts about this one?
Hi, Tanya. I do have some maybe bigger thoughts about 14 in general, and
Okay.
I guess what I'm just looking at this list of topics, and it puts together, you know, use of force, and then also other things that are happening, like, you know, asking someone to be removed from car or backseat detention, and then a bunch of questions about search. And, you know, in light of the Inspector General report from LA and some of the questions that were raised at the last board meeting, I wonder maybe if these things could be separated into separate questions. That, like, for example, if there was was force used, and then a list of things that would constitute force, which would be at least 10 or 11 of the elements here, then, you know, if nothing happened, then that could be bypassed, and there might be more focus and perhaps better reporting on some of these things that happen more frequently. So, I mean, whether or not pulling a canine, you know, removing the canine from the car, I don't know if that constitutes use of force, or how one would do that, but it seems that maybe separating, like, you know, using however we define a use of force continuum, and, you know, all of the things that, you know, whether it's brandishing a weapon, pointing a weapon, discharging a weapon, or removing the canine, or actually deploying the dog, it seems that we would want that in one question, and then the other sort of actions that are taken incident, you know, to a stop would you know, also want to be separated, and at least that way it might lead to better reporting. This is my thought.
Thank you for that feedback. Any other thoughts or questions about this one?
Yeah, this is David.
Either
Swing.
generally or about, yeah. Excuse me.
I agree with Dr. Band on his thought process a little bit as I kind of processed what he was saying. If we separate out use of force, just as an example, and it's canine deployment, and if we know the actions that preceded that, let's say, for example, it's a high-risk car stop, and as which is for a potentially armed or serious other violation. And we go back and look at the data, and we realize that when a canine is deployed, there's less other force that's applied later on, because the canine helps to calm or de-escalate the situation from that perspective. That might prove useful for law enforcement as a profession to know that canines on scene throughout the state, our studies have shown there's force is not usually applied after that, the canine helps to gain compliance. And so I think it would be helpful if we captured the use of force separate, and also captured the actions that preceded any type of use of force by the subject involved. So was it flight? Was it active resistance? Was it fighting? Was the suspect armed? Was the suspect unarmed, et cetera? I think things of that will help us collect better data that will help us make better policy decisions. And I've heard that from my law enforcement colleagues in the Wave 1, Wave 2 agencies as well, along the path.
Thank you. Any other feedback? And it could be just generally about this data element or specifically about those two K9 data values.
I was just going to echo, because 14A is a very, they are all potentially officer-initiated actions, but it's quite long list, that the grouping, the ones that are around searching, obtaining consent, seizing property, maybe those also constitute a natural different grouping. Also partly for just whatever would make filling out the forms also easier or more streamlined. It doesn't become too onerous because the data is going to be very, very valuable to analyze. But I don't have a magic suggestion about the, perfect grouping or how to break them up. But I think this is a little bit in the spirit of what was raised already.
I just want to note, in light of the new legislation banning carotids and chokeholds, we will be deleting that one.
Nancy, I meant to take that out.
Yes, sorry. Sorry we didn't catch it.
No, I appreciate it. So I guess what makes sense is maybe we just talk about these collectively. If you have any questions about any of the proposed changes to the actions taken by officers during stop, some of them I think probably are more straightforward, but I just want to make sure you all have a chance to provide feedback on all of them. If there's anything that doesn't make sense or should be revised. Okay, I'll move on then to basis for search. 14B, we are just adding probable cause the person committed a crime, again for the same reason under reason for stop. Officers were saying that, at the time of the basis for search, they had probable cause to make that search, and there wasn't an accurate category for that. So we wanted to add that as a data value. Any thoughts there? Okay, we'll move along. The next one is under 15, result of stop. If you see,
I apologize. Could I ask a naive question about 14B? I'm sorry, I know we're about to move on.
No, you're good.
Probable cause, just so I can also better understand from a lay perspective, reasonable suspicion, probable cause, do some of these categories already, do they constitute reasonable suspicion? Do some of them already constitute probable cause?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of these already do constitute probable cause. So like, visible contraband, that's probable cause. So if you see, we're asking the officers to select all that apply. So yes, a concern would be, an officer would just select one, but they'd select, say, visible contraband, but not also select probable cause. Without getting too much into it, but there might be ways which we can kind of prompt officers in the form itself to select probable cause, like if they select something that already assumes probable cause, like visible contraband.
Is there a simple example of checking off probable cause, but that didn't fall into one of these other bases?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but yeah, I'm not totally sure. I can get back to you about that, but I think it's more like a catch-all category.
I have a question. Maybe Chief Swing can help me process this. I keep thinking probable cause to the person committed a crime kind of comes in the search incident to arrest because you have probable cause to arrest usually. Is that, I mean, it's a, I keep trying to, is it the same category? Just calling it two different things?
If you have probable cause, it'd be incident to arrest at that same point. And so just looking at it as well, so in case it's better to say reasonable suspicion. So you have a lower standard there, reasonable suspicion for a search. If someone makes a car stop, officer makes a car stop and sees a bag of methamphetamine, well, that's evidence that's visible contraband. And so there's probable cause for the arrest right there, assuming that's the only person in the vehicle. And so, yeah, it feels a little bit, maybe a little redundant. Maybe it's reasonable suspicion, the lower standard. I don't know, but I understand your point.
Thank you for that. Is there any more feedback or comments, questions about this one? Okay, thank you. So the next one is under 15, results of stop. So we wanted to change contact parent / legal guardian or person legally responsible for the person. The original language was, it should have been in the stop data form, excuse me. The original language was, let's see, contacted parent, legal guardian, or other person responsible for the minor. And so we just wanted to make it clear first that the parent or legal guardian is a person legally responsible for the person, but also expand the category not to just minors, but to people. Any thoughts about this one? Board Member Woods, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted. Sorry.
Okay.
Did you want to keep other person legally responsible or other person responsible? I'm just curious.
We added in, yeah, we're proposing to add in legally and replace minor with person. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no.
We have lots of people who are responsible, but not legally.
Yeah, we want to, if I'm understanding correctly, your question is, are we adding in the legally part? Yeah, we're adding the legally language in there. So it's clear that the person who's responsible is legally responsible for them, if I'm making sense. Okay. Any other thoughts about this one? Okay. The next one is under 18, type of assignment of officer. We are thinking of adding an off-duty and or working private event as the assignment of the officer at the time the officer made the stop. And this is to kind of to contextualize the stop and when the officer made it. Any thoughts about this one? Okay. Great. The next one is adding in a data element of race or ethnicity of the officer. And again, this was to provide further information about the stop and the stops and to analyze data related to these stops. And the same reasoning goes to gender of officer if we wanted to also discuss that at the same time. Any thoughts about these two categories?
Well, I mean, I think it's great to add this. I wonder if it's possible to automatically populate these two fields. If maybe someone can fill out once and then it might save a little time.
Yeah, I agree. It should be able to self-populate based on the officer completing the form, logging in.
And that's what's currently done with years of experience and the officer ID number.
Okay, any other thoughts or feedback about these two? Great, thank you. So I think what makes sense now, there's a few other proposed amendments that are not reflected in the stop data category, but so if we turn to page 34 of the PDF, it's a chart summarizing all of the proposed amendments. I just want to walk through some of these other ones that we haven't yet discussed. Some of them we have, but let me open up my, give me one moment. I just need to open up this chart. So we've discussed a few of these. As I might have mentioned, I think I did, in addition to adding a data value of welfare or wellness check / community caretaking, we're also proposing adding a definition of that. Similarly, we're adding definitions of match suspect description, match description of suspect's vehicle, and definitions of reasonable suspicion and probable cause. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts about those definitions? And if, I'm happy to give you a moment to take a look at those definitions as well, if you have specific feedback about those definitions. They kind of start at page, they start at page 8 of your PDF.
Tanya, again, what are we looking at specifically?
The definitions of, as you'll see, there's like some red line definitions starting at, yes, actually, these definitions that I'm referring to actually start, on page 11 of the PDF.
I don't have any questions. They seem to be taken out of penal code or other legal source for reasonable suspicion and probable cause.
What was that, Chief Swing? Did we look at?
No, I said they seem to be taken from a legal source, the definitions of reasonable suspicion and probable cause.
Yep, that's right. Any other thoughts about these definitions? Okay.
I want to change them to accurate.
Okay. The next one is to amend the definition of custodial setting. So right now, custodial setting, which is on page, the definition starts on page 8 of the PDF. We're seeking to add, to define custodial settings to include a courtroom or courthouse where a person is remanded into custody. So existing regulations do not require an officer who is remanding a person into custody to submit a stop data form, but we've gotten questions from officers wondering whether or not they're required to submit a stop data form for any time they're remanding someone into custody. And to make it clear that they do not, we are proposing to revise the definition of custodial setting. Okay, any thoughts about that one? Okay, I just realized one change that's not reflected in your chart is a revision to consensual search. So if you go to page, or if you stay on page 8 of the PDF, we're proposing removing or may be implied by conduct So changing the definition so that you can't consent. So it says right now, consent can be given in writing or verbally or may be implied by conduct. So we're proposing removing or may be implied by conduct because based on what some of our experts have said, it's a little subjective. And consent consent might not be perceived as consent by one officer as it would be for another. So any thoughts about that change?
I'm sorry, this is Brendan. Can I back us up to custodial settings for a second? This might be outside of our scope, but has there been any thought put into including police vehicles?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't. You mean to add it as a custodial setting?
Correct. 'Cause I struggle with the definition of in custody versus custodial setting. When we think about in custody, for example, Miranda warnings, just that you're not free to go in a custodial setting or in custody. And so when we say in custody and custodial setting, just defining what we mean there exactly. And I think a police vehicle is close to a custodial setting.
So to be clear, and I think and this is not something we've discussed, but one reason we may not want to include police vehicles under custodial settings because there might be scenarios in which we want to capture actions taken by an officer when a subject is inside a patrol vehicle. And if we were to include a patrol vehicle under custodial settings, that would it may exclude that stop from being reported as a stop, if that makes sense. So I'll write this down as some notes and we'll definitely look into it. Going back to consensual search and our proposal to remove or may be implied by conduct, does anyone have thoughts about that?
Can I ask a question about that? Does that imply that for some agencies, officers may be asking for consent or obtaining verbal consent, but that for others, consent was checked off in cases where officers were using their own judgment that there was consent? I guess I'm asking really about maybe even the training and the training around this form, even if that change is made, will that imply a policy change for departments? So I'm very curious about how consent is obtained, and maybe Chief Swing or others can weigh in on this too.
I'm unaware of any consent that is exercised without a verbal affirmation or in writing. I don't know what implied by conduct would look like, and so I think it's either verbal affirmation or in writing.
Any other questions?
Brendan, maybe Mr. Woods might have some other experiences that he has seen in his tenure.
My tenure. Yeah. I've seen the argument made for implied consent when an officer asks to, for example, search someone's backpack and they don't say anything, but they're holding it like this, and then they take the backpack and search it. So they're saying it's implied consent. We get into a lot of legal arguments around that. We don't think it's implied at all, but I've seen that used as a reason to get into backpacks or bags or whatever item may be.
Right. Yeah.
Or I'm going to search your pants and you don't say no, they argue it's implied consent.
So then it's basically the interpretation of consent.
Any other thoughts? If not, I'll move on to the next proposal.
So it sounds like the proposed amendment removing implied consent brings us in line with what Chief Swing described as what could be happening, and if there are cases that don't align with that, it's important to know about them, but maybe those cases we don't want an officer just checking off, oh, I had consent. So maybe it's very clarifying actually to tighten this up or to remove the implied consent. Sorry, we can go ahead. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. And let me just check on time. It looks like we have about 15 more minutes of discussion, then we move on to public comment. So the next change that we haven't yet discussed, scrolling to the second page, is clarifying reporting obligations under existing data elements. So we're proposing revising the description of duration of stop and providing an example of this. So if you go to page 12 of your PDF, it starts at page 12 and goes on to page 13. We're trying to make it clear that the stop ends at the time the person is taken into physical custody, which we're defining as being transferred away from the location of the stop, or when the person is free to leave. So we're adding in the language by being transported away from the location of the stop. And we're including an example, number 3, about what that means. And the reason we're adding this clarifying language and example is we want to make it clear that, for example, the act of handcuffing a person does not end the stop. The officer would still need to report actions taken after handcuffing, if to the extent they have any. And so that's the purpose of that example. It looks into that scenario. Any thoughts about this one? Okay. The next one is revising the language and providing an example under actions taken by an officer during the stop. Again, for the same reason I just stated, we are trying to make sure the officer reports all of the actions taken, either before they handcuffed a person. It's basically until that person is free to leave, or you take that person into another location, you have to report all actions taken. And if you'd like to see that change, it's on page 19 of the PDF. Any thoughts about this change or proposed change? Okay. The next one that we have not discussed would be, let's see. So if you scroll to page, there's a couple of changes we're making to Article 4 reporting requirements. So we're adding a few new reporting obligations. So this is page of the chart. It's page, let me get that for you. It's page 37 of the PDF. So one thing that we're doing, and I'm sorry, it should have been reflected in your stop data form, but to the extent there's a scenario where an officer is with a reporting agency and they're working with another agency that's not a reporting agency, like DEA. Even if the non-reporting agency is the primary agency effectuating the stop, the officer who is part of the reporting agency would still need to complete a stop data form. But to contextualize that stop, we are proposing adding, I guess, like a data value for the officer to say that they are working with a non-primary agency, so that it's clear that, to the extent some of the actions taken are not necessarily their own actions, it could be because of the non-primary agency, if that makes sense. Any thoughts about this one? And I should make it clear, we also provide an example of this that hopefully explained it better than I did. And that is, on page Excuse me? Is that Board Member Wood?
I have a question otherwise outside of this when we're okay. So I'm not sure how many additional items you have left. There were a couple of questions I had for things that aren't on the form that I wanted to touch on and hopefully get some feedback from my committee members and potentially include that.
Thanks for reminding me of that. I'm sorry, I should have given you an opportunity to provide that. If it makes sense to all of you, what I could do is kind of quickly describe these additional reporting obligations that we're adding or revising. And we can always have another meeting about these as well. But just generally, if that makes sense to folks, I can do that and then give the board members an opportunity to provide additional amendments. Okay, I'm going to assume that works. So another reporting obligation that we are seeking to add is adding in additional, this is hard to describe, but requiring officers to report a stop if an officer takes certain actions during a programmatic search. So generally speaking, if it's a programmatic search where an officer is not using their discretion, they wouldn't have to report a stop, but they would have to if they took certain enumerated actions. We're adding in that reporting obligation. And then we're expanding the list of actions that an officer would, that would prompt an officer to have to report a stop if there are taking those actions during the course of executing a warrant in a person's house. And specifically, the actions that would trigger a stop data form to be completed is pointing an electronic control device or an impact projectile weapon at a person inside the residence. As it stands now, if you point a firearm, that would prompt you to have to complete a stop data form, but we're adding in additional actions that would require a stop data form to be completed. The next set of amendments are to clarify existing obligations. So as it stands right now, an officer does not need to report a stop involving certain programmatic searches unless they take certain actions. And we're adding another category of a programmatic search, which includes transit sweeps. That's not a specifically enumerated category, and so we're adding that. So what that means is an officer who is conducting a transit sweep would not have to report a stop data form unless they take certain actions. And then we also clarify that an officer would have to report interactions that take place with people inside a residence during the course of executing both an arrest and search warrant. As it stands right now, we just have the language saying warrant. So if you're taking actions against a person while executing a warrant, you have to report a stop data form. But we're trying to make it clear that you have to do that whether it's an arrest or a search warrant. Similarly, we are clarifying that if the officer takes actions toward a person who is a subject of a warrant, they would not have to report that stop if it takes place inside the residence, but they would have to do so if it takes place outside of the residence. And then finally, the last one is to permit agencies to confidentially disclose stop data for the purposes of advancing public policy. Right now, there's no language specifically allowing agencies to do that. It allows the Department of Justice to forward the stop data that we have to academics for purposes of scientific study. And we just want to make it clear to agencies that they can do the same. Sorry to run through that, but I just wanted to give time for the board members to give additional proposals. So I'll leave it open for all of you to give any additional proposals that we haven't thought of.
Can I just ask a question about the warrants? So is the distinction there that if you're serving a warrant on someone in their home, that doesn't have to be reported on, but somebody who stopped because they believe there's an outstanding warrant, or in the process of a stop they discover there's a warrant. Is that the reasoning behind that distinction?
I don't think I explained it clearly enough. So if an officer is executing a arrest or search warrant inside a residence, they don't need to report that as a stop if it's involving the subject of that warrant. However, if their action took place outside of the residence when the officer is trying to execute that warrant, they would have to now report that stop. So we're trying to clarify that distinction between outside or inside the residence. Any other questions or additional proposals that you may have?
Hi, this is go ahead, Lily. Dr. Kajabi, go ahead.
Well, I don't know if it's the place for it, but I realized that I've had a terminology question about frisks versus searches. And on these forms, or California has chosen to try to capture how searches are being used. But I was wondering if, for the purpose of this form, like, as a search of a person, does that include frisking? I guess from a lay perspective, I understand the standards, the legal basis for frisking someone versus searching, say, a car versus searching a home. They're all very different. And so I guess I'm asking if somebody was frisked, where would it fall under this? Would that be a search of a person? I guess that goes to anyone at DOJ or Chief Swing or anyone else.
It would likely fall under 14A as I look at that. That's where all the search type checkboxes are located. And as I'm scanning this, I don't see a pat down search for weapons, which is probably the closest thing to a frisk. That's not terminology that I'm familiar with. In terms of a definition, it's a New York stop frisk type.
Yeah, that's just I was wondering, given interest in other municipalities. And also when Brendan reminded me about if someone's pockets are emptied, I was sort of starting to think about some of the gradations between those. Sorry, Nancy, were you starting to?
Yeah, so under the definition of search, it does include a pat search. And so I believe that there is an opportunity to discuss to whether it is a pat search or not either in the open narrative, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but I think that pat search may be one of the options.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. It just says search of a person was conducted, but I don't see pat search.
I do see now under definition of search can include body or property, including pat down search of person's outer clothing. And so I don't know if an emptying the pockets is a search, and if what some people call a frisk here is a pat down search. I see Brendan nodding.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is correct. I think Chief Sweet can also pipe in. The outer pat search is the same thing as a frisk. And anytime you're emptying pockets out, that is an actual search.
Yes. But we do capture all searches, including pat searches. I guess we're just not differentiating between the different types of searches unless the person explains it in the open narrative field. But if they found contrary evidence, it would no longer be a pat search.
Okay, yeah, this is clarifying. Thank you.
While it could also be a pat search that ends up finding contraband, do a pat search for weapons and you find a weapon, then obviously the search becomes incident to arrest. I do see value in under the search of a person, bifurcating pat search and other full search or other search, however that's phrased. I think that this one is clearly more intrusive or less intrusive than the other. Can I ask questions about stuff to add. And I may sound like a broken record here. I'm going to ask the question either way. Because we're using the American Community Survey and the demographic data behind that, and the transient nature of people with commuting and shopping and other things, other reasons to go, tourism, et cetera, I still find value in having a way to indicate if the person was a resident of the jurisdiction, who's filing the report, filing the stop data report, as a way to help us evaluate stop data based on local resident or not. And I know the board has had that conversation, I think, previously, before I was on the board. I would just ask to entertain that again, that we have an opportunity. This comes from the law enforcement profession, not just through my own lens. They have opportunity to have that distinction if the person being stopped is a resident of the local jurisdiction or not.
Any other additional proposals? So far, I have two, differentiating pat searches and a regular search of a person, and adding in whether the stopped person is a resident of the jurisdiction.
I've seen on some stop forms, and I think it can be quite interesting, the question about whether someone is asked about their community correction status and then how they answer. And I think if there was some effort to maybe take question 14A and split it up in a way to group things and make, it might actually make it faster going through the form. But in thinking of actions that are taken during a stop, I think that's one that is often a source of tension in communities. Perhaps might be worth looking into.
Yeah, and I
Member,
agree with that.
Just so I understand your proposal, is it to ask whether, to add a data value as to whether the officer asked about the correction status or supervision status of the person stopped? Is that what?
Yes, and then what the answer
Okay.
was. Yeah.
Okay. I also have, we talked about it earlier, but the various proposed changes to the nature of stop data element as well. Any other proposed changes or additional changes?
Tanya, did you capture also if we separate out, for example, force used, the preceding actions preceding the use of force?
Yes, thank you. I did have that as well.
Can I ask one last time? I realized that I had a misperception about the very first item, vehicular versus pedestrian coding. I realized that as it's structured, vehicular is supposed to mean just motorized vehicle, so it wouldn't include bicycle. And in the definitions on the form, I now realize pedestrian actually is anything that's not vehicular. So I just want to come back, and maybe this is where we started. We looked at the first item, but echo the recommendation that instead that pedestrian be its own category, and that either cyclists and potentially other, that they be broken out. I don't think it will gum up the filling out of the forms. The vast majority will be vehicular, and then a very large number pedestrian. But that pedestrian is meaningful on its own as a category, and so maybe useful to not include cyclists, and also to not include the example where someone in a wellness check, if that's becoming part of this, would go into an apartment or something like that. That it seems fundamentally different than stopping a pedestrian on the street for an officer. But I realized that I hadn't deduced that everything else right now was going into pedestrian.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. So I'm just checking the time. It's 4:43, and I just want to leave some time for public comment. But does anyone have other proposals? And also, as part of the agenda, it looks like we'll also determine whether or not we want another meeting before this goes before the board as well.
Well, perhaps we should move to the public comment period and then discuss whether we want to have another meeting.
I also just want to say thank you very much, Tanya. You did an excellent job. I really appreciate it. I'm sure the board does as well. So,
Yes, thank you, Tanya.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm not sure how we facilitate the public comment period. Do we have to admit people into the session? Or do people raise their...
Not for this one. And Aisha usually does it, and she's off today. We gave her a day. We gave her some time off. So basically, if you're interested in doing public comment, if you're in Northern California, you can unmute yourself. And how about 2 minutes? Does that seem okay, co-chairs? Is there anybody in Northern California that would like to give public comment? Okay, how about Central California? Is there anybody in Central California that would like to give public comment? All right, Southern California. Anybody in Southern California?
Hi, everyone.
Hi there.
I'm not sure if, hi, everyone. Thank you for all your work. This is Karen in San Diego. And I'm a little concerned that we don't have a lot of, community people stepping up here. And I know that's probably your concern as well, but I think that there's an awful lot of good work. I put a lot of comments in the chat. I knew y'all wanted to kind of cut me off, but you let me go, and I really appreciate that. Thank you for all your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Is there anybody else that like to give public comment on the phone or anybody else? All right. Well, just want to also, Karen, just as you probably recall, we will have a very lengthy public comment period once the regulations are posted, but we're glad to have the opportunity to hear from people ahead of time before we present these items to the Attorney General for his consideration. So Steve, I will turn it back to you.
I'm muted, sorry. We have a few minutes reserved for discussion of next steps. We had a great conversation. Thank you so much, Tanya, for orchestrating that and for shepherding us through all those changes. And I guess the question is now, do we want to have another meeting before So do the board members believe we need another subcommittee meeting to review the revisions and the feedback that was provided today?
When is our next meeting, large meeting?
I believe it's mid-December.
December 2nd.
Oh,
That meeting is will be focused on the report itself. This is Allison, by the way, answering the question.
Hi, this is David Swing. Just so everyone knows, my video is really slow and buffering, so I had to turn my camera off. I'm still here, available on the phone.
This is Brendan. It may be difficult to get another meeting in prior to the 2nd with the holidays in place.
Just to clarify, we would have another meeting. We would have a board meeting separate from the December one on at least in part on this these regs. So, you know, and we'd have to notice that, give 60 days worth notice. And so we could have a subcommittee meeting anytime before that other board meeting, if the board wants it, or if the subcommittee wants it.
Right, and in that meeting right now, we're thinking the full board meeting would be sometime in February. We would have to notice that in December for February, because it's a 60-day notice period for a full board meeting. And as I mentioned, we haven't even provided this information to the Attorney General yet. So, so I think that there's plenty of time between now and when the full board meets. If you all wanted to have another meeting, we could send out an email, or we could ask the co-chairs if they want to go forward with another meeting, or you can decide now if you want to go forward with another meeting. But it would probably be maybe after the holidays.
And Nancy, presumably we'd be looking at a revised stop form with all of the changes we've discussed, and perhaps the additional questions that have been, or the additional fields that have been offered today. Would that be, I guess, the subject of the purpose of the meeting? Yeah.
Sure. Or if there's, you know, there's other items that you think of. I mean, anyone, the public, anyone here can send us email ahead of time. This is just really like a workshopping session. There's going to be plenty of time once we actually have the information, you know, published to weigh in, and then between the time it gets enacted as well. So it's up to you. I think that you guys had a very productive meeting, but if there's more things that you want to add, we like I said, we could have another meeting, and who knows, it may be that we don't have another board meeting until the beginning of March. It depends on how long it takes the Attorney General to review the information being provided to him. The idea is to have a full board meeting once the regulations are published by the Office of Administrative Law, so that the full board can, you know, discuss what is being proposed and weigh in on those.
Well, I mean, I would suggest that we wait until there is a, you know, something that's published, and perhaps the full board can weigh in. I think we accomplished a lot today, but I'd also defer to my co-board members as well. So I'm happy to meet again if there's desire for that.
I know it.
Go ahead, sorry.
This is Brendan. I'm fine either way. One thing I'm curious about seeing is to break down, or maybe a revised section of 14A on the stop data form. That's one thing I'm really curious about seeing at some point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like I said, you can always if you can always decide to have another meeting. I think that there'll be